The pen felt heavier than it should have. Celeste Grant stared at the document in front of her. 3 pages, dense legal Korean on one side, English on the other. One empty line waiting at the bottom for her name. Across the table sat the most feared man in Seoul. Kwon Ji-hwan didn't fidget. He didn't check his watch. He just waited like he had all the time in the world and she had none. "Once you sign this," he said, "there's no version of your life that goes back to what it was." Her hand hovered over the paper. 3 weeks ago she'd had a company, a fiancé, a best friend, a future she spent 9 years building with her own 2 hands. Now she had a choice between prison and a stranger. She signed her name. Neither of them said a word. Neither of them knew yet that this contract, written to save her from ruin, was about to teach them both something they'd stopped believing in a long time ago. To understand how she got to that table, you have to go back 3 months. Celeste Grant grew up in Johannesburg, the oldest of 3. When her parents died in a car accident, she didn't get time to grieve. She got a mortgage she couldn't afford and 2 younger siblings who needed someone steady. So she became steady. She worked 3 jobs while finishing her business degree at night. She mixed her first skincare formula in her aunt's kitchen, selling small jars out of the trunk of a borrowed car. She named the brand Alara after her mother's middle name because every jar carried a piece of the woman who raised her. For years it was just Celeste. Founder, chemist, delivery driver, 4 hours of sleep and a stubborn refusal to quit. By 29, Alara skincare was stocked in boutiques across 3 countries. Beauty editors praised formulas built for skin the big luxury brands had ignored for decades. Her younger sister Naledi had graduated university. Her brother Thabo was applying to engineering school. For the first time since her parents died, Celeste let herself imagine a future that didn't feel like survival. She had a fiancé, Marcus, who told her he was proud of her. A best friend, Zainal, who'd known her since primary school. And then she had an offer that seemed too good to question. An international investment group, backed by a soft-spoken man named Richard Voss, wanted to take Alara global. Expansion into Asia. A flagship store in Seoul. More capital than she'd ever had access to in her life. She should have asked more questions. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit subscribe now. You won't want to miss what Celeste is about to walk into. She signed the partnership papers on Tuesday. Marcus stood beside her. Zainal hugged her outside the lawyer's office. She had no idea she'd just handed her enemies exactly what they needed. It took 11 days for her life to fall apart. First a call from her accountant about a transfer she never approved, then a letter from the bank. Alara's accounts frozen pending investigation. She called Voss. No answer. She called again. Voicemail. By the end of the week she understood. The partnership contracts weren't what they looked like. Buried in the fine print was a clause reassigning company liabilities directly to her. Liabilities Voss's group had built quietly through transactions she'd never seen, engineered to look like they came from her hand, fraud, money laundering, charges with her name on them. She needed Marcus. He didn't answer his phone. When she finally found his apartment, it was empty. So was the wedding account he'd promised to manage. Gone along with him. Zainal's betrayal was worse. Prosecutors needed a witness close enough to Celeste to be believable. Zainal, under her own financial pressure, took a settlement and agreed to testify that Celeste had falsified the records herself. Celeste sat in a lawyer's office and watched the footage of her oldest friend lying under oath. Within 3 weeks it was over. The banks seized everything. Business journalists who once praised her started calling her a fraud. Her siblings' scholarships, tied to her financial guarantee, were suddenly in danger. Naledi called in tears, asking if the headlines were true. Celeste didn't have the strength to answer. She sat alone the night before her arraignment, telling herself she had nothing left to lose. That was when the envelope arrived. No stamp, no return address. A man in a black suit left it on her doorstep and walked away before she could ask a single question. Inside was a single card embossed in gold. Everything you've lost can be returned. Come alone. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock, the Han River Tower, Kwon Ji-hwan. She'd heard the name before, always in the hushed way people talk about things they're afraid will hear them. I am 35 years old. Seoul's most powerful and most feared man, a name mentioned in the same breath as politicians who owed him favors and rivals who'd simply stopped appearing in public. She had every reason to refuse. She had nothing left to lose by saying yes. The top floor of the Han River Tower was quieter than she expected. No wall of bodyguards, no performance of power. Just floor-to-ceiling windows over Seoul at night and a man standing at the glass with his back to her. "Miss Grant," he said without turning, "thank you for coming." When he finally faced her, she understood why people feared him. It wasn't cruelty in his expression, it was controlled, the stillness of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "I know what happened to you," he said. Richard Voss has crossed me before. He's careless with the people he destroys along the way. You're not the first. Does that matter to you? Celeste asked. Because I intend to end him, he said, and because I have a use for someone the world already believes is broken. He laid out the offer with the same flat precision he might use to close a business deal. He would clear every fraudulent charge, erase the debts Voss had buried her under, restore Alara's frozen assets, guarantee her siblings' safety. In exchange she would become his wife, for 1 year, on paper only. Separate lives inside the same house, he said. Separate rooms, no expectations beyond appearances. In 1 year the contract ends and you walk away with your name cleared and nothing owed. If I refuse, then I wish you luck in court, he said. No malice, just a fact. She searched his face for the monster the headlines described. She found a man who had made her an offer with no hidden trap, no visible cruelty, just cold, transactional certainty. She thought about Naledi's voice breaking on the phone. She thought about 9 years of her life reduced to a case number. 1 year, she said. Then I'm free. Then you're free, he agreed. She didn't shake his hand, she just nodded. And somewhere behind his composed expression something shifted, so briefly she almost missed it. 3 days later she signed the contract. The mansion sat behind gates that only opened for cars Ji-hwan personally approved. Celeste arrived braced for menace. What she found instead was order. Quiet, disciplined, almost monastic order. An elderly housekeeper named Mrs. O showed her to a wing of the house entirely separate from Ji-hwan's. Meals at set times. Certain rooms are off-limits. A driver for any outing, always accompanied. Alone that first night, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, Celeste muttered to herself that this wasn't a marriage. It was a very well-funded prison. She wasn't entirely wrong. She wasn't entirely right either. Ji-hwan kept his distance those early weeks and she kept hers right back. Dinners were silent, transactional. When they spoke, it was to negotiate terms. What events required her presence? What questions she wasn't allowed to ask? You don't have to like me, he told her once. You only have to survive the year. I intend to do more than survive it, she said, holding his gaze without flinching. I intend to rebuild my life while I'm here, with or without your permission. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, that she hadn't simply agreed. She wasn't afraid of him, and that seemed to unsettle him more than any threat ever could. She pushed on the rules that felt more like control than protection, and to her own surprise, he sometimes gave way. He wasn't used to being challenged inside his own home. He was even less used to finding that he didn't mind it. By the end of the first month, their quiet war hadn't built trust, but it had built attention. He started noticing the hours she kept, the sketches of new formulas scattered across the desk she'd claimed for her own. She started noticing him too, the way his guards straightened around him without being told. The way Mrs. O's face softened whenever he walked into a room, like she saw someone the rest of the world didn't. Neither of them said anything about it, not yet. The first crack came on a night she wasn't supposed to witness. She'd gone downstairs after midnight for tea and found Ji-hwan in his study, on the phone speaking low and urgent Korean to someone at a children's hospital. She caught enough. A surgery, a family who couldn't afford it, an anonymous account he was authorizing before morning. He ended the call and found her in the doorway. For a moment something close to panic crossed his face, like he'd been caught at something he never meant for anyone to see. It's not what people think, he said quietly. None of this is for anyone to know. Hide it, because the moment the world learns Kwon Ji-hwan has a soft place, he said, someone finds a way to put a knife in it. She didn't push further that night, but she started paying attention. She learned he funded 3 orphanages across Seoul through shell foundations with no trace of his name on them, that he personally covered medical bills insurance wouldn't touch for loyal employees' families, that Mrs. O wasn't just staff. She'd worked for his grandmother, the woman who raised him after his own parents were gone. He cooked for her on her birthday every year. One day the kitchen belonged to him instead of the household. She's the only person who's never needed anything from me, he admitted. Everyone else always needs something. What about me? Celeste asked. What do I need from you? He thought about it longer than she expected. Nothing I haven't already given, he said. So I don't understand why you're still arguing with me about the decorating budget instead of just taking what's offered and staying quiet. Because quiet isn't who I am, she said. And I don't think it's who you actually want beside you either. He didn't answer. He also didn't look away. The household began to change without either of them namming it. She started eating breakfast at the same time as him, not because the contract required it, but because she'd noticed. He read business reports in silence every morning and eventually started reading her ideas back to her instead. He began, without meaning to, making her laugh. dry, understated humor that caught her off guard the first time, until her own laugh surprised her, and his controlled expression cracked into something rare. Neither of them called it what it was becoming. Rebuilding a Lara from inside his world wasn't easy, and Celeste refused every shortcut he offered. "I don't want you to fix this for me," she told him, the first time he offered to call investors directly. "I want to earn it back." So he didn't fix it. He simply made sure the doors Voss's smear campaign had slammed shut quietly reopened. A distributor here, a retail buyer there, never with his name attached, never framed as charity. Celeste did the rest herself. She rebuilt the formulas from scratch. Rehired 2 women from her original team who'd stood by her even after the scandal broke. She pitched a relaunch with the same relentless drive that built the company the first time, except now she pitched it as a woman who had survived betrayal and come back sharper for it. The first order came through in her 6th week in the mansion. She screamed loud enough that Mrs. O came running, certain something was wrong, and found her laughing and crying at the same time over a confirmation email. Ji-hwan found her an hour later, still laughing. "You did that yourself," he said, not a question. "I did," she said. "Thank you for getting out of my way." "That's the hardest thing I've done in years," he admitted, and for the first time she saw him smile. Not the controlled expression he wore for cameras and rivals. Something real. He taught her to make his grandmother's stew one evening when the staff had gone home, both of them laughing at how badly she chopped the vegetables. She dragged him to a night market against every protective instinct in his body, and watched the most feared man in Seoul haggle cheerfully over the price of grilled skewers. He came to her product launch and stood quietly at the back of the room, not as Kwon Ji-hwan, but as a husband watching his wife take back everything that had been stolen from her. When she scanned the crowd afterward, this was the first face she looked for. "You didn't have to come," she told him. "I wanted to," he said. "I don't think I've wanted anything for myself in a very long time." Marriage no longer felt like a performance. It felt dangerously like the truest thing in either of their lives. "We're just past the halfway point, and things are about to get a lot more dangerous. Stay with me, because Celeste is about to learn exactly what loving this man costs." She noticed it first in the small things, saving stories from her day to tell him at dinner, missing him for 2 days he traveled for business. The way her chest tightened every time he walked into a room, like her body had decided something her mind was still refusing to admit. He noticed it in the way his schedule bent around her without his permission. Meetings moved so he'd be home for her calls with Naledi. Security briefings cut short so he could hear about her day. "I used to think love was a weakness men in my position couldn't afford," he told her one night on the terrace, the city spread out below them. "And now I think it might be the only thing worth fighting for." Neither of them said the word yet. It hung there, in the way his hand found hers on the railing, and neither of them pulled away. Their year was half over. And both of them independently had started dreading the day it would end. Neither knew the ending coming for them wouldn't be the one written in that contract at all. Richard Voss hadn't disappeared. He'd only gone quiet, rebuilding leverage while Celeste rebuilt her life in the open. When his network discovered the woman he'd framed for fraud was now married to Kwon Ji-hwan, he understood immediately what he was looking at. Not an obstacle, an opportunity. Ji-hwan had spent a decade building an empire without a single exploitable weakness. Now he had won. Voss reached out to the Beak organization, a rival syndicate that had waited years for a crack in Ji-hwan's defenses, and handed them exactly that. Together they began gathering everything they could on Celeste, her siblings' locations, her routines, the gaps in a marriage that on paper still read as a business arrangement. The first warning was subtle. A car idling too long outside Naledi's apartment in Johannesburg. A message to Celeste's business email, vague but unmistakable, referencing details about her family that no stranger should have known. Ji-hwan's response was immediate. Security around the mansion tripled overnight. Guards appeared outside her siblings' homes on 2 continents. For the first time he told her plainly what he was protecting her from. "Beak organization doesn't make threats they don't intend to follow through on," he said, his composure cracking into something close to fear. Not for himself, she realized, for her. "Because of me," Celeste said quietly. "I'm the weakness they found." "You're not a weakness," he said sharply. "You're the only thing in my life worth being afraid of losing." That's not the same thing. Lying awake that night, listening to patrols circle the grounds, she couldn't unhear the truth underneath his words. Every precaution he took made him more exposed, not less. She had walked into his world to save her family. She wasn't going to become the reason his enemies finally found a way to destroy him. She made the decision alone, the way she'd made every hard decision since she was 20. She waited until he left for an emergency meeting, gathered only what she needed, and left a single letter on the desk in his study. The same desk where she used to leave her sketches for him to read. "I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you," she wrote. "I'm leaving because I love you too much to be the reason you lose everything you've spent your life protecting." She severed the contract through his lawyers. No further protection, no continued involvement. A clean, deliberate break, meant to remove herself as leverage before Voss and the Beak organization could use her against him. It didn't work the way she hoped. Within 2 days of leaving the mansion's protection, a car forced her off a quiet side street. By the time anyone realized what had happened, she was gone, held in a warehouse on the city's industrial outskirts. A bargaining chip in a war she tried to remove herself from. Ji-hwan came home to find the letter, and an hour later, the news that she'd disappeared. Something in him that had stayed controlled through every betrayal, every threat, every year of violence he'd carried so no one else had to, finally broke. "She left to protect me," he told Mrs. O, the letter shaking in his hand, "and it got her taken anyway." He didn't sleep that night. He sat with his lieutenants until dawn, tracing every thread Voss and the Beak organization had left behind, driven by something far more dangerous than his usual calculation. For the first time in his life, Kwon Ji-hwan wasn't fighting to protect his empire. He was fighting to get back the only person who ever made him want a life beyond it. The warehouse smelled like rust and rain when Celeste finally heard the doors break open. 3 days in, she'd refused to give Voss the satisfaction of watching her break, holding on to the same resolve that had carried her through a fraudulent trial and a year of rebuilding herself from nothing. When Ji-hwan appeared in the doorway, his men were already moving through the room behind him. She almost didn't believe it. "You came," she whispered. "You didn't think I wouldn't," he said, crossing the room and pulling her into arms that trembled, not from adrenaline, from fear he was only now letting himself feel. What followed was fast and absolute. With evidence his people had spent 3 sleepless days assembling, falsified contracts, shell transactions, Voss's own messages to the Beak organization, the fraud case against Celeste collapsed entirely. Authorities moved against Voss and the Beak leadership in the same night. The rival syndicate that had waited years for Ji-hwan's weakness found instead the full weight of his empire turned against them at once. By morning it was over. Voss was in custody, finally facing the charges he'd once pinned on her. Celeste Grant's name, dragged through headlines for a crime she never committed, was formally cleared. Alara's frozen assets were released in full. He stayed by her hospital bed that night, holding her hand like he still couldn't believe she was real. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for leaving without telling you. I thought I was protecting you." "You were protecting me the only way you knew how," he said. "But I don't want protection that costs me you. I never did." 2 weeks later, once the last of the legal proceedings closed, Ji-hwan asked her to meet him in the study where their year together had started. The marriage contract sat on the desk exactly where it had been the night she signed it. "There's still time left on it," she said quietly. "I know." He picked it up and tore it in half without hesitation. "I don't want you here because of what this paper says. I want you here because you choose to stay." He knelt in front of her, not the controlled man Seoul feared, just a man who'd finally found something worth being afraid of losing and worth fighting for anyway. "Celeste Grant, will you marry me? This time without a contract, without conditions, just because I love you and I don't want to spend another year pretending I don't." She laughed through tears she didn't try to hide. "You already have my answer," she said. "You've had it for weeks." "I was just too scared to say it out loud first." "Say it now," she whispered. "Yes, Ji-hwan, this time for real." 1 year later, Alara Skincare opened its first flagship store in Seoul. The expansion she dreamed of the day she signed the papers that nearly destroyed her, finally hers on her own terms. Naledi ran Alara's African operations from Johannesburg. Thabo, finishing his engineering degree, spent his school breaks in Seoul, teasing his brother-in-law about the mansion's excessive security, which had quietly become a home rather than a fortress. Ji-hwan spent the year moving his organization's holdings into full daylight, stepping back from the world that once defined him. Together they founded a foundation for young entrepreneurs failed by the systems meant to protect them, and for children who, like he once had, needed someone to believe they were worth investing in. On quiet evenings, they still sat on the terrace where they'd first admitted without words that a fake marriage had become the realest thing either of them had ever built. Celeste Grant had lost everything once. She got it all back, and something she never expected alongside it. A man who was never supposed to belong to anyone, choosing every day to belong to her. If this story kept you hooked until the end, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments what you'd have done in Celeste's place.